Welcome to the Subverse. I'm your host, Susan Mathews. This is a podcast where we journey from the cosmic to the quantum, from the complexity of development to the art of resistance, from colonial histories that haunt us to reimagining futures. In this episode, we discuss heat and specifically thermal inequality. With increasing heat waves brought about by accelerated climate change, we can see tremendous fallouts all over. And I wanted to discuss this, but through a historical colonial lens, when climate science was sutured to racial difference and ideologies, when pigmentation and bodies in the tropics were all enmeshed in creating sciences such as meteorology, and in how pathologies were treated. And the guest who expertly guides me through this is Dr. Bharat Jayram Venkat, an associate professor at UCLA's Institute for Society and Genetics, with joint appointments in the departments of history and anthropology. His first book, At the Limits of Cure, was published in 2021, which tells a story that stretches from the colonial period, a time of sanatoria, travel cures, and gold therapy, into a post-colonial present marked by antibiotic miracles and their failures. Much of his present research is on thermal inequality in contemporary India and the United States, as well as the history of studying heat and its effects over the long 20th century. He conducts some of his research through the UCLA Heat Lab, which you will find out more about in our discussion. I found my guest by reading a wonderful article he published in June 2022 on race, thermal sensation, and the nervous body in late colonial India. So, we picked on some of the themes in the piece, where he tells us of how various kinds of bodies were understood to be differentially affected by heat, producing both biological variation and pathology. Heat was a persistent obstacle to the British Empire, where sensitivity to it played out as both fragility and was treated as something only white bodies could feel, as opposed to brown and black bodies. For the fragile empire, the Indian sun was more threatening than the Indian sepoy, as they depended on these native armies to hold on to their empire. With this racial ideology also came a hierarchy of labor, and Venkat brings home these hierarchies in contemporary examples around workers who face extreme heat in construction, agricultural labor, and delivery jobs. The knowledge of heat was considered crucial to maintaining the integrity of the colonial enterprise in India, and we can extend that to the crises we face now. Who constructs and holds these present knowledges of heat? What are the thresholds we have already crossed and will cross? Who are burdened by already intersecting inequalities? And how will these be mapped onto work, livelihoods, living conditions, and in medicine? For me, this conversation really brought up all kinds of troubling questions and scenarios. But I also found that his work had opened my eyes to how making heat visible also leads to questioning histories of science and opening up new pathways to thermal justice. Bharat, welcome to the Subverse.
Thanks for having me.
Bharat, I'd like to start off with the following question. With the accelerated changes in climate, one of the fallouts is extreme heat. And in an article that you'd written so vividly that we are already living and dying from the catastrophic effects of climate change. This is not a problem in the future. This is a present problem. And we see this in different parts of the world, and how we adapt to this is crucial if we are to survive. And your own work is on the subject of thermal inequality. So I'd love for you to define what thermal inequality is and what it entails, and how is exposure to extreme heat and its effects unequally distributed?
Sure. Thank you for that question, Susan. So we know that certain parts of the world tend to be hotter than others. That in and of itself is not a problem. When people fall ill or die from the effects of heat, it's not simply because it's hot outside. Environmental or climatic heat is not in and of itself a danger, or at least it's usually not a danger. What matters is how that heat comes to be filtered or mediated by our environments, by our lives, by the social and political infrastructures that make us vulnerable to heat, the biological infrastructures that make us vulnerable to heat. So when I speak about thermal inequality, I'm referring not simply to the distribution of heat and it's the kind of unequal distribution of heat. Rather, I'm speaking of the unequal ways in which the effects and kind of downstream consequences of heat come to affect some more than others, right? So if I can give you a couple of examples of this, something very mundane. If you think about a particularly hot day when you don't feel like going out and you pick up your phone and you order food from a restaurant. When you do that, somebody has to bring that food from the restaurant to your home. In that moment, the exposure to heat is being unequally distributed between you and your driver, between your delivery person. That person then takes on that kind of heat burden or heat exposure so that you don't have to. Here in the US, I think often about the work of migrant laborers, those who come in seasonally to harvest strawberries, lettuce, all sorts of things on the California coast. Their work in that kind of hot summer heat allows American consumers to purchase relatively cheap produce from the grocery store without having to endure that experience again of extreme heat in the fields of California, Oregon, and Washington. Now, the important thing to kind of underscore here is it's not necessary that you're deliberately doing this. We don't think in our minds, oh, I'm going to make someone else more vulnerable to the effects of heat so that I can escape from them. Rather, these are kind of structural problems, the ways in which we distribute, where we divide not just labor, but laborers. So we think certain kinds of people can be exposed to the effects of heat so that others don't have to. And I think about this a lot in terms of the work of Ambedkar, right? Where he talks about how caste works and the kind of labor involved in caste, right? It's not simply that you have a division of labor and people do different kinds of things. It's that certain kinds of people are slotted into certain kinds of roles and certain kinds of jobs. And this is true across the board. This idea that, in the US, for example, Black folks who are Latinx, Asian American, are more able to tolerate high heat. This kind of racial ideology allows for certain people to work, say, in automotive factories in Detroit or on the fields in California. And we see this in India as well. The kinds of labor that certain people do, say, in construction, say, in selling things outdoors. These are very much divided along lines of caste and ethnicity and so on, even gender, right? So not everybody is exposed to heat in the same way. And moreover, not everybody is equally vulnerable. We also have real differences in the ways in which our bodies are able to withstand and tolerate heat that are biological or physiological in a sense, but aren't purely so. So, for example, we think about people with different kinds of disabilities. Our bodies are not equally capable of tolerating the same degree of heat. And yet, when we think about how, for example, if we hear warnings from National Meteorological Associations telling us, don't go outside today, it's very dangerous, or avoid the heat if you can, those thresholds are based on certain kinds of bodies, normative bodies, usually men's bodies, usually able-bodied folks, right? And so the assumption is that the level of heat dangerous for this group applies to the population across the board. And this is patently untrue. Moreover, if you're somebody, say you're working in an office, or you're middle class, whether it be here in the US or in India, somebody who's moving from an air-conditioned office into a car that has air conditioning and then going home where they have air conditioning as well, the effects of heat are not going to be that impactful for them as it is for somebody who is constantly outside, right? So there's this kind of whole range of factors from those that are immediately in the body to our built environments, both inside and outside, to the kinds of work we do or are forced to do, all of which shapes our exposure to heat and the effects of heat in our bodies.
I know that a lot of the work that you're doing is within the Heat Lab at UCLA. I checked your website and I was so fascinated by the diversity of projects that you have going on there. So if you could just tell us a little bit about the Heat Lab.
Sure, I'd be glad to. So the UCLA Heat Lab was founded in January of 2020, and it currently has about 15 undergraduate students who I'm working with on a variety of projects related to heat and thermal inequality. Because heat is such a kind of complex topic, right? It's not something you can address from one disciplinary perspective. It requires you to think about the work of geographers, climate scientists, sociologists, anthropologists, but also physicians, biologists, evolutionary biologists, even chemistry, material engineering, architecture, urban planning. It's very, very difficult because you have to really be willing to think and engage in this interdisciplinary way. So I can give you a couple of examples of projects that we've been pursuing recently. We have one group, for example, focused on the effects of heat on people in the United States who've been incarcerated. So we know that carceral facilities in the United States, prisons and jails, tend to be sited in locations that are extremely hot because they're often these places that are less desirable, right? So places that are have more desert-like conditions, or places that are in locations that are already hot because of the existing climate. And then they're made of materials like retain heat that actually make those who are inside of these facilities hotter than the surrounding environments. And then finally, you have the fact that it's incredibly difficult to get access to cooling within prisons. You often don't have air conditioning. Air conditioning is thought to be a luxury, and therefore politicians who are running for office don't want to be seen as quote unquote soft on crime. And so they actually oftentimes refuse to provide air conditioning to incarcerated people under the presumption that this is not a necessity, even though it actually is these days. And so what you see is high rates of heat-related illness and even heat-related death in carceral facilities. So we've been working to try to understand this problem, to understand who is most vulnerable and why. Another project that we're working on right now is kind of closer to home at UCLA campus, which is trying to understand the exposure of food truck workers. So here in California, we have a lot of food trucks, basically trucks outside selling all kinds of great eats. And during the kind of height of the pandemic, many of the students on our campus began to rely on food trucks for their meals because a lot of the dining halls were closed down, or students didn't want to go and eat inside these kinds of closed environments. So my students during the pandemic became quite interested in what was happening to food truck workers, what was the thermal environment inside of these metal boxes. What they found is that many of these trucks get to be over 100 degrees Fahrenheit for several hours at a time. You have workers who are working without breaks because there's only one or two people at any given time working in a truck. And so they can't really stop. They have to keep working. They can barely run out to use the bathroom. You have air conditioners that are placed, if they exist, very near the ceiling, and so that cold air just goes directly out. And we heard so many stories about people who experienced heat stroke, who fainted on the job. But we also heard stories about people saying, you know what, like the people who really do get sick are in fact white people. And this is why we don't hire white people into this kind of work. So again, this kind of deeply racialized and racist idea about what kinds of bodies are vulnerable, what kinds of bodies are not. The surprising thing, however, is that we heard from workers of color, so from Latinx, Asian American, Black workers, we heard them tell us, oh, actually, we are in fact more resilient to this heat, right? So this is an idea that's not simply just one that you're hearing from, say, white owners of trust, but you're hearing it from workers of color who have absorbed this idea. And this is patently not true, right? There are ways in which we can come to be acclimatized to a certain degree, to a certain extent, against increasing temperatures. But there is not a kind of racial resilience. There's nothing in our genetics or in our biology tied to race that allows us to withstand the effects of heat. And yet this idea is so pernicious and so long-standing, going back to the era of slavery, the era of indenture. This is part of the logic that allowed for Indian and Chinese coolies to be shipped around the world to do all kinds of work. This is the logic that allowed for enslaved Africans to be brought over to work in plantations. This idea that these brown and black bodies were resilient. They were able to withstand the heat, to do this kind of difficult labor under the hot sun. And this is also the logic that allowed for white bodies to be placed in the shade, to occupy the role of overseers, those who are highest in the hierarchy and able to watch over and control rather than do this labor themselves, right? So this kind of racialized ideology about who is vulnerable, who is resilient, and how this then transforms into a regime of forced labor that shapes the world for hundreds of years and continues into the present moment.
Thank you so much, Bharat, and thank you for bringing this up because how I came across your work was because you'd written this amazing piece in 2022, which was entitled Through a Glass Darkly: Race, Thermal Sensation, and the Nervous Body in Late Colonial India. I really enjoyed it so much, and I love the title. I'm a big Philip K. Dick fan, so thank you. And in this article, you write about India's emplacement within a region of the world described as tropical and how central the problems posed by heat were. And within this tropicality, various kinds of bodies were understood to be differentially affected by heat, producing both biological variation and pathology. You've already indicated what this is about, but I'd love for you to talk more about this in this Indian context and within this late 19th century conversation.
Sure, I'd love to. I think the place to begin is with the bifurcation of the world into areas that were tropical and areas that were not. This idea, this word tropicality, allowed for this really powerful flattening out of climatic, geographic, even cultural differences to produce this idea, largely in the European imagination, that there was this entire swath of the world that shared something in common, and this was tropical heat, right? And this bioclimatic or biogeographic imagination, there was something about climate that shaped constitution, it shaped identity, it shaped culture. People who live in certain kinds of places were certain kinds of people who did certain kinds of things, who held certain kinds of beliefs and ideas. This is an idea that you can trace all the way back to Hippocrates. And this idea is still alive and well in the 19th century. So in the period of British colonial rule in India, you still have this strong commitment to the idea that Indians, broadly construed, are a certain kind of way because of the fact they live in a tropical place. And that tropical heat has effects on white bodies. And this is a real challenge. This is not simply an idea to be debated amongst academics, but this is a primary concern to the vitality of the British Empire. One of the questions is, can you have permanent settlement in a place like India? Could you actually have a sustained British white presence, or are white bodies far too vulnerable and fragile to remain in India? What would happen if someone were to stay for decades or generations? What would happen to their offspring? Would there be degeneration, right? So the concerns about racial degeneration were central to this, not just through racial mixing, but through the idea that by simply being in a place like India for generations, your descendants would become weaker, more fragile. Their brains would almost melt in a way, right? That men would become feminized, that they'd become vulnerable to horror of horrors, homosexuality, right? That the tropics had all of these effects on behavior and biology. So it's within this context that you have imperial meteorologists like Blandford, but also physicians who are doing all kinds of research to try to understand the effects of heat on different kinds of bodies, but also using bodies to understand the effects of heat. And in a place like India, or in the context of empire, when you have these large swaths of kind of tropical colonies, there is this question about, one, how do we understand the heat? And then two, how do we understand the ways in which heat affects different kinds of bodies? And the way this often plays out is through discussions of skin color, pigmentation, to understand, what is the role of pigmentation? Why are some bodies black? Why are some bodies brown? Why are some bodies white? And what do those pigments afford in terms of protections, right? So, drawing on all kinds of frameworks, some of which are biblical, some of which are evolutionary, they're trying to understand, what does skin color permit or allow? What does it allow us to understand about climate? How does it mediate the effects of climate? And so what you see emerging in the late 19th century is an idea that bodies are in fact active, composed of active materials, specifically nerves, right, that filter the effects of heat and light. And so the Indian sun is thought to be particularly pernicious to white bodies. It's quite different from, say, the sun in Australia or the sun in Britain. And so the question becomes, what does the brown body allow? What does brown pigmentation, black pigmentation, how does it protect? Or it must have some protective value, goes the logic. And what is that? And the idea develops that darker skin, in fact, blocks the light and the heat from exciting the nerves and causing a kind of deregulation, right? this overheating that's not simply about too much heat, but it's about the heat actually exciting the nerves and causing bodies to become dysregulated, right? Of course, the bodies that are most vulnerable to the effects of heat are white bodies and also white women's bodies, right? This fragility is, of course, central to what it means to be a woman, right? To be a British woman, to be one who symbolizes to be always in some ways on the edge of hysteria because one is sensitive, right? That sensitivity is double-edged. It's what allows for one to be refined, but it's also what makes one more vulnerable to the effects of things like heat. And this is kind of a reoccurring theme, is that the presumed vulnerability of white skin to heat is indicative both of higher refinement, of a certain kind of sensibility and a capacity to appreciate the finer things of life, ability to even perceive the effects of climate. Because in some sense, darker skin is inert or just blocking. White skin sensitivity makes it a kind of incredibly important measuring device, a kind of instrument for understanding the effects of climate in a way that darker bodies can. So for scientists in the colonies, white bodies actually become really, really interesting tools for understanding climate because of that sensitivity. That sensitivity is also what, again, reinforces the idea that white folks belong as overseers, as governors, rather than as laborers. So what's interesting here is that this racialized hierarchy, where you would think that the way it would work would be that white bodies are somehow stronger. But in fact, in this case, it's actually the fragility of white bodies, a kind of idea that white bodies are biologically fragile and vulnerable that makes them also superior. So it's a really kind of clever inversion of what we might imagine in terms of racialized hierarchy to make fragility or vulnerability into what is thought to be the best or the most refined or the most civilized.
We'll be back after a break. Yeah, in fact, I found that really interesting. I think especially when you talk about Nathaniel Alcock and Fraser, and it just seems like they just tied themselves up in knots in terms of their argumentation and logic.
Yes, absolutely. So, you have these two scientists, physician scientists, Alcock and Fraser, who are really trying to understand. There's an idea that dark colors absorb more heat, but dark skin somehow absorbs less heat. How do we explain all of this? How do we understand what's actually happening in the body? You have to remember these are the early days of biomedicine, of physiology, as we understand it today. And so they're really trying to, on one hand, square their understanding of biology and racialized biology with these ideas about race and racial difference, right? As well as with emerging ideas about climate. They don't quite know what is it that happens when sunlight hits you. What is the difference between light and heat? How do those things permeate into a cell, into a body? What do they do within the body? So there is, on one hand, a genuine attempt to understand this using the methods of 19th century speculative science, right? So it's largely based on observation, sometimes personal observation of other bodies. There's a real instability in thinking about what is race, what is climate, how does climate affect race, and how do we even come to study this? Do we just think about what happens to our own bodies, what happens to the bodies of our patients or people we see? Do we need to travel someplace? Can we simply look at the records? How do we go about studying these kinds of things? And whose job is it, right? Is it the job of the meteorologist? Is it the job of the colonial official? Is it the physician, the surgeon? Is it the scientist sitting at home? Like, what are the proper methods and who are the proper people to be doing this kind of work?
And one thing I also found fascinating in the article is that you talk about this racialized ideology and these differentiated bodies. And you also speak about how that became such a central problem for the British, the heat, in terms of their empire.
Absolutely. So, I've already spoken a bit about the fact that permanent settlement becomes perceived as almost an impossibility, right? There's a kind of strong consensus that white bodies cannot persist under the tropical sun. There are dissenting voices. So you have certain British scientists, European scientists who are saying, well, I think it is possible for white bodies to acclimate over time to the tropical heat. But these voices are often kind of in the minority. Instead, you have the kind of upspring of commodity sales. So clothing, things like helmets, solar topies, even this particular kind of fabric that's kind of a spinal column. It's a kind of padding you would place over your spinal cord to protect you from the effects of heat, along with your pit helmets, along with certain kinds of, what you would imagine as kind of colloidal clothing, right? And the idea is that these clothes, which can be purchased in, metropolitan London, can protect you against the effects of heat no matter where you go with the tropical colonies, because all of these tropical places are more or less the same. And so you buy these clothes and you wear them and you'll be safe. It even goes so far as to develop underwear, for example, that is of certain colors that are meant to mimic the properties of brown and black skin, right? So racialized biology and pigmentation become something to be desired in a way, right? To be mimicked through certain kinds of fabrics that can then be applied to white bodies. You can abstract away certain kind of protective properties from black and brown bodies without actually becoming that body yourself. And this is critical to kind of the discourse and ideology of imperialism, that one can somehow maintain at all costs some sort of distance or difference between colonizer and colonized, right?
And like you mentioned in the article, including using the colonized army to protect them.
Yes. One of the things people often discuss when thinking about colonialism is the fact that the British were able to rule India with a rather small standing force of white British soldiers and administrators. If you think about it, there's really a tiny number of British forces on the subcontinent, but somehow they're able to maintain control. And the way they do this is largely through Indian armies, right? Through Indian soldiers, through Indian infantry. And this is surprising for multiple reasons. And I think most salient to our conversation is the fact that after, what's often referred to as Sepoy Mutiny, the Great Indian Rebellion, there's deep suspicion or skepticism from the crown, from the British more generally, about the reliability of Indian soldiers. Can we trust these infantrymen? Are they going to turn on us at any moment? Despite these concerns, they continued to rely on Indian soldiers. And a big part of the reason has to do with the fact that they were more afraid of the effects of heat on white bodies than they were on the potential rebellion or mutiny of Indian soldiers. And this, to me, points to the deep fragility at the heart of empire, and one that is in some ways conditioned by climate. Climate, in some sense, posed a kind of limit or a kind of existential vulnerability to empire sustainability, and one that really quite troubled the British.
That leads really well to the next question, which is this empire of climate. And you quote Montesquieu, where he says that the empire of climate is the first of all empires. And I'm interested to see how we can take these histories and what we've understood about racial ideologies, and how does that apply now in our contemporary times? How do you see this playing out within the way the climate debate or the effects of climate change are playing out?
That's a great question. I think where I would look to answer that question is to politics. So we've discussed a lot about how climate is tied to the sciences of race, of meteorology, geography, so on and so forth. But there's also this kind of abiding question of the political, and the way in which climate science, climate change is so tied to politics today, to debates about what is real and what is not, and what we should do about it. How do we invest our money? How do we think about priorities? And I think that when we think about the empire of climate in a moment that's at least nominally post-colonial, we might think, well, this is no longer a concern. But in fact, the empire of climate, I think, continues to give shape to the contours of thermal inequality, to the question of who is and who isn't exposed. If we think about the drawing of national borders, if we think about who is forced to endure the worst aspects of heat, much of it is tied to the ways in which politics structures society and structures who can and who cannot be inside and outside, whether that be inside and outside of a national border or inside and outside of a home or of an air-conditioned space. I do a lot of my research in Chennai, a lot of my research in Delhi, and when you have power outages, you see where the power remains and where the power is cut, right? You see, for example, private homes and small businesses, shops where electricity is gone. And then you see these big call centers where the power remains on, where there's electricity running Sometimes it's because their own kind of private generators. Sometimes it's because certain areas are protected to kind of keep the flows of capital going. You don't want to lose overseas business. And this kind of organization of priorities means that certain people in certain things, even computers require air conditioning to work. And so you prioritize certain kinds of beings, animate and inanimate, and keep those cool. And certain kinds of bodies are made sacrificable, made vulnerable. And this to me has everything to do with the kind of political organization of the distribution of heat.
That's a really fascinating answer. I also enjoyed what you said at the beginning about when you talked about kind of the hierarchies of labor. And I wonder whether when we talk about the future of work, I think heat will probably play a very big part in that also.
I was just talking to a colleague the other day about this new insurance scheme that I think Rockefeller is trying to roll out in South Asia, which is specifically to offer women heat insurance. So basically, the idea is that on days that are too hot, women can apply to recover lost wages through this insurance scheme. And this is part of this really fascinating move towards climate insurance. So, climate catastrophe has done a couple of things to the insurance industry. On one hand, places like California, they've stopped insuring because there's such a kind of existential threat, right? There's kind of certainty of loss. It's not worth it. On the other hand, it's provided the possibility for developing new kind of insurance tools, new kinds of products, new kinds of things to sell, new kinds of markets to sell it to. And one of those increasingly is heat insurance. And I think that's a really interesting form of response to this problem. I have a lot of questions about what are the thresholds for this, how much will they get paid, and how do we kind of think about this. But I think this speaks to broader questions about how we think about harm, how we calculate it, and what we think the proper response should be. Should it be something like offering lost wages? Should it be something like rethinking our structures of labor entirely? How do we think about who is exposed and who's not? What's considered a safe condition? And, how much we should be paying for things like rice or for other kinds of staple crops, right? How do we think about the value of those given the increased risk to workers today?
Thank you so much, Bharat. I'd like to know a little bit about the work that you've done in India, linking it with the conversation that we've had. I'm really interested to pick your brain in terms of record temperatures right now in India. How do you see this really playing out? Are there any particular variations regionally or anything else that you'd like to share with us?
So my ethnographic work in India related to heat is somewhat incipient at the moment, but I will say a couple of things. In the last couple of decades, you have an increase in the frequency, intensity, duration, and length of heat waves, but we don't necessarily see an increase in the number of deaths. This is a good thing in a way. What this means is that there is adaptation going on the ground. People are responding to that in creative ways, finding ways to avoid being exposed or being out in the heat. So that's in some ways an encouraging sign. It also points to the fact that it's not extreme heat in and of itself that's deadly, right? It's the combination of the extreme heat along with the ways in which we live and structure our societies. That said, the other thing that'll remain important is finding ways to keep track of what's happening. Heat, as I mentioned, remains largely invisibilized because it is so ubiquitous. And that phenomenal kind of ubiquitous nature of heat comes to have a real shape in how we register heat's impact. So to give you an example, I was speaking to a physician a few months ago while I was in Chennai, and I asked him, have you diagnosed cases of heat-related illness in the clinic? He's somebody who sees, maybe hundreds of patients a year. And he said, I really haven't. And I said to him, this is odd because we know that things are getting hotter. We know that there should be more and more cases of heat-related illness. And he said, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, there's no reason why I shouldn't see this except that I'm not looking for it, right? And he kind of said to me, I'll be honest, I don't think we're looking for it. I think we see someone come in and they're sick. We think about everything else they might have. We think about heart attack. We think about stroke. We think about exhaustion. We think about all this other stuff. But we don't really consider heat as a causative agent because it's so ubiquitous and because we're not looking for it. So heat is something that you don't see unless you look for it. And you have to kind of know, is it just simply hot or is it dangerously hot? Or for this specific body, for this specific person, is it too hot, right? Where are those thresholds? And how do we begin to look for and count heat-related illnesses and heat-related deaths?
For me, this is absolutely fascinating because this podcast, the theme is fire, and heat just plays such a central role in that. And I think it's important for people to know what these nuances are in terms of how we view these problems. So thank you so much. And if there's anything you'd like to leave us with, any parting thoughts, please do so.
So I'm actually working on a book right now, which is called Swelter, A History of Heat in an Unequal World, where I'm trying to write a history of heat science broadly construed over the last 200 years and understand what are the origins of what we know about heat today. The normal temperature is 98.6 degrees in the body, right? Where does that number come from? How do we figure that out? And is it even true? And there's a really interesting history that goes back into 19th century Germany and the development of thermometers and the collection of millions of data points. It turns out to be no longer accurate if it ever was, because bodies are changing over time in response to who knows what. And so our body temperatures are actually potentially dropping. And what does that mean for our capacity to withstand higher temperatures? How do we think about the conjoined effects of things like fevers and extreme heat? How do we think about the fact that higher temperatures are making things like dengue, Zika, yellow fever spread to parts of the world where they didn't exist before? So what do we think about, if somebody gets chikungunya in the south of France, how does that make us rethink what we call a tropical geography? And how would we think of things like chikungunya, yellow fever as climate-related illnesses? Or even something as simple as, falling off a ladder or a traffic accident. Because, there's an article that came out last week about how heat affects sleep, right? So when it's very hot, we don't sleep as well. This is just an established fact. And when you don't sleep as well, you lose concentration and focus. And so you're more likely to, say, get into a traffic accident or go to work and fall off a ladder or have an accident of some sort. At present, we don't really look at those as being climate related. So how do we start to connect the dots where we start to kind of understand things like mosquito bites or traffic accidents as being climate related? And how does that kind of fundamentally transform how we approach climate change and its effects? Right? So that's what I'm trying to do with this project. Yeah.
It sounds absolutely brilliant and a lovely title again. I think you've got good title form.
Yeah. No, I just wanted to say thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure, and I've loved this conversation.
Thank you so much. Thanks to Dr. Bharat Jayram Venkat for sharing his thoughts with us. The Subverse is the podcast of Dark and Light, a digital space that chronicles the times we live in and reimagines futures with a focus on science, nature, social justice, and culture. You can follow us on Instagram at Dark and Light Zine. If you like the show, please tell a friend and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. The Subverse is produced for us by Waka Media. So long, and thanks for listening.